The first time I met the new vice president of operations and infrastructure, he was standing in front of our massive data visualization wall like it was a private aquarium. He was staring at the shifting heat maps of our network routing tables, nodding slowly as if he understood a single packet of data crawling across the screens. He tilted his head back, squinted his eyes, as though he was admiring an abstract painting in a gallery, and then turned to the room. He smiled widely and said, "We need to turn this dashboard into a compelling story, folks. Numbers without a narrative are just empty static." Everyone in the room nodded along to please him. I did not. I simply stood at the back of the room and made a quiet mental note that the executives had hired a colorful peacock to do a welder's job. He walked over, offering a handshake like a cold, limp fish. His smile was wide, but it never reached his eyes. "Call me Preston," he said, drawing out the syllables of his name like he was presenting a luxury consumer brand. I caught a faint scent of something expensive and ridiculous, perhaps a mixture of imported sandalwood and vanilla. He wore a tailored blazer and a grin like he was auditioning for a sitcom. I watched him scan the open-plan office, taking in the marketing department, the design teams, the sales floor, and finally landing on the corner where my team sat. We were the infrastructure architecture department, the unglamorous, heavy-duty backbone that kept the entire company operating day and night. "We will need to perform a comprehensive audit of your workflows," Preston announced, waving his hand like a priest dismissing a sin. Efficiency is my middle name. I wanted to ask him if inflated ego was his first name, but I kept my mouth shut. I had been working at Zenith Asset Management for over 13 years. I built this proprietary trading network from scratch when we rented cloud space by the gigabyte and used spreadsheets as backups. I had onboarded 6 chief technology officers, survived 4 chief executive officers, and mentored a dozen junior systems engineers. I did not care for corporate politics. I did not attend happy hours, and I certainly did not enjoy explaining to people with business degrees why server uptime was not optional for a financial firm. I cared about one thing and one thing only, that our systems worked. I cared that every single hour, every system update, and every minute anomaly was patched and resolved before anyone outside of our operations center even realized a problem existed. But Preston did not care about the guts of the machine. He wanted the vibe. On his second day, he made the rounds like a politician, running for office. He tossed out generic compliments like stale breadcrumbs. "I just love the energy in here," he would say. "This team really gets the vision. We are going to break some paradigms, people." When he finally reached my quiet corner of the floor, the section devoid of colorful beanbag chairs and soft mood lighting, he squinted at the live server topology map displayed on my wide monitors. "And what exactly is this supposed to represent?" he asked. "Live network routing and active load balancing for our primary portfolio engine," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on my keyboard. "Right," he cut in, raising his hands in front of him as if I had drawn a weapon. "You are going to have to translate that into layman's terms for me. I do not speak that technical jargon. You have to dumb it down." He laughed loudly at his own joke, expecting the room to join him. Nobody did. I turned my chair to look at him. "It is the system that processes $200 million in daily transactions." His smile twitched, and I saw a brief flicker of annoyance in his eyes. From that moment on, I knew exactly what I represented to him. I was a relic of the old guard, a blocker, a stubborn obstacle to be bypassed. Preston did not understand what he did not understand. He genuinely believed the flashing green and blue lights in the server room were just cosmetic decorations. He thought our monthly risk mitigation reports were optional reading, and he assumed that the cloud was a magical place where someone else took care of all the security. Worst of all, he assumed I was just a technical grunt with no corporate leverage and no spine. That week, he decided to cancel our quarterly disaster recovery simulation drill because he claimed it was too alarmist and wasted developer time. "Come on, Gavin," he said to me during a department meeting. "Do we honestly believe the entire primary infrastructure and all backup routes would fail at the same exact time? That is like preparing for an alien invasion." I glanced across the conference room to see if anyone else was ready to walk out. Devin Miller, my senior network engineer, was squeezing his plastic water bottle so tightly that the material buckled with a loud pop. Fiona Briggs, our database administrator, was blinking rapidly, as if she had just stared directly into a solar eclipse. We were all thinking the same thing. This man was going to break our system, and we would be the ones left holding the shovel. Yet, I kept my face entirely neutral. I nodded when required, and I even clapped when Preston concluded the meeting with his ridiculous slogan about disrupting mediocrity. But the moment I returned to my desk, I quietly began preparing for the storm. I logged every single configuration change he ordered, saved every email where he dismissed our technical warnings, and compiled it all into a secure, encrypted folder on a local hard drive in my desk drawer. I labeled it Reference Materials, but in my head, I called it the Ark. It was not built out of spite. It was built as insurance because when a ship is steered by a blind captain, the architect had better know where the lifeboats are hidden. The memo arrived at 7:12 in the morning, time-stamped like a digital death certificate. The subject line read in bold letters, Infrastructure Streamlining Proposal for Immediate Cost Savings. It was one of those standard corporate documents that smelled of middle management desperation, complete with vague diagrams, a bar chart with no vertical axis labels, and empty phrases like low-hanging fruit and opportunity buckets. Page 2 was where the actual knife slid in. Preston had proposed to phase out our secondary, uninterruptible power supply backups in Data Wing B. His justification was written in cold, clinical terms. The primary power supply had been completely uninterrupted for over 3 years, making the return on investment for the secondary backups non-demonstrable. I stared at the document for so long that my hot coffee went cold in my hands. He was proposing to cut our redundant power systems to save a small fraction of the budget. Let me be clear, those secondary backups were not luxury items. They were not nice-to-have features like standing desks or catered lunches. They were there because 4 years ago, a squirrel nested in a utility relay and half the local power grid shut down. Our trading system stayed online, not because of good luck, but because we had planned for that exact scenario. During that incident, the primary power vanished in a microsecond, but the secondary backups kicked in instantly, keeping the database transactions flowing without a single byte of corrupted data. If we did not have those backups, our database would have suffered catastrophic corruption, resulting in millions of dollars in lost trades and compliance fines. Preston did not know that story, and he did not bother to ask. Later that morning, during a department meeting, he smiled and said, if the Titanic had better budget controls, they might have skipped the extra lifeboats, but think of the savings. The room laughed nervously. I did not. Actually, I said, looking up from my notebook, the Titanic did not have enough lifeboats. That was the primary reason 1,500 people died. Preston chirped back, different times. Modern systems do not need so much redundancy. We have service-level agreements, cloud auto-scaling, and mirrored disks. He did not finish his sentence, probably because he realized he did not understand how those terms actually work together. That same week, Preston rejected my quarterly security audit. He claimed that testing for edge case vulnerabilities was overkill and a product of fear-based thinking. We are wasting precious developer hours on scenarios that will never happen, he argued. You think hackers care about us? We are not a major search engine. We are not exciting enough to target. Fiona Briggs turned to me afterward and whispered, should we send out an invite to ransomware groups? You know, save them the trouble of looking for us. I knew then that arguing was useless. Preston was completely blind to the reality of modern cybersecurity. In a high-frequency trading environment, a single unpatched vulnerability in our application programming interface could allow an attacker to inject malicious requests, siphon user funds, or freeze the entire order book. Testing for these scenarios was not a waste of time. It was the only thing preventing a complete catastrophe. I started documenting everything. I saved every single email where Preston ignored our explicit warnings, every chat message where he brushed off our technical concerns, and every budget cut he ordered without a valid architectural explanation. I stored them in the secure folder I had created, mirroring the files to a cold storage device in my desk drawer. I was building a solid foundation of evidence, preparing for the day when the system inevitably collapsed under the weight of his incompetence. Preston then pushed for what he called a visual modernization of our administrator dashboard. He complained that the interface looked too sterile and demanded animated charts, bright neon colors, and rounded buttons to give it some pop. Devin Miller asked him directly, "Do you want it to be useful, or do you want it to be cute?" Preston smiled and replied, "Why not both?" A modern interface inspires confidence. He did not understand that this dashboard was the control center for a $200 million portfolio management engine. It was designed to display critical logs and real-time network latency, not to be a visual playground for executives. That was the exact moment I stopped trying to change his mind. You cannot explain to someone who has never fixed a leaking pipe why duct tape does not belong on a high-pressure valve. You simply wait for the explosion, and then you show them the manual they refused to read. I spent that night updating our disaster recovery protocol. I did not change the technical architecture, but I moved the cryptographic escrow keys into a separate legal holding clause. I inserted an obscure provision that would trigger a fail-safe protocol if a senior officer voided critical infrastructure redundancy without consensus from the engineering team. General Counsel Dorothy Ward signed off on the compliance update automatically, viewing it as standard risk mitigation. It was just another boring line of legal text in a document that nobody read, but it meant that when the ship started sinking, I would be the one holding the keys to the lifeboats. Preston continued to push his cost-saving measures, completely unaware of the mechanism I had put in place. He thought he was streamlining the department, but he was actually removing the structural supports of a building. I watched him strut around the office, celebrating a 2% reduction in infrastructure costs as if he had saved the company. Meanwhile, our network latency metrics were slowly rising, customer support tickets were piling up, and the overnight developers were complaining about random access denials from the automation cluster. Preston claimed it was just a minor software bug. I knew the truth. It was systemic entropy, and it was entirely his fault. Preston booked the large conference room under the title Infrastructure Pulse Check, which sounded harmless enough, like a meeting to discuss server uptime or deployment schedules. I walked in expecting a standard pep talk and perhaps another presentation about corporate synergy. Instead, I found myself facing a firing squad in business casual. Preston sat at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up, a coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other. He was flanked by 3 junior engineers, 2 DevOps analysts, and Beatrice Thorne from the Human Resources Department. Beatrice was the kind of human resources representative who claimed to be a culture ambassador right before she filed a performance warning against an employee for their tone. "Let us keep this casual, everyone," Preston began, opening a thin folder that had my name printed on the tab. "I just want to get a sense of where we stand, what is working, and what is legacy." I did not take a seat. I simply leaned against the wooden doorframe with my arms crossed, watching him perform his scripted theater. He started with a few shallow compliments about our recent server migration before shifting his tone. "But one of the things I have been hearing," he said, stretching out his words, "is that we might be over-allocating our technical resources. Perhaps we are clinging to old protocols and being too cautious." He looked at me, expecting me to argue. "Gavin, you have been with the firm for over 13 years, he said. "That is a long tenure, but sometimes long tenures can lead to a certain rigidity, a reluctance to evolve. I notice we are still running our own private certificate authority for internal communications. Isn't that a bit retro?" I stared at him, maintaining a completely flat expression. "Our private certificate authority is the reason our internal services can communicate securely without relying on third-party public registrars," I explained. "It prevents man-in-the-middle attacks and ensures that even if an attacker gains access to our local network, they cannot spoof our microservices. It is not retro, it is standard security architecture for a financial system." Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Nate Ross, one of the junior engineers, looked down at his laptop screen as if he wanted to disappear. Preston laughed, trying to dismiss my answer with a wave of his hand. "Passion, I love it," he said. "But passion needs to be balanced with fiscal reality. When I reviewed your salary, Gavin, it raised some eyebrows, especially when we compare your output to the cost." There, it was, the opening move to push me out of the company. No one is saying you haven't earned your spot, Preston continued. But we need to make space for new voices, modern frameworks, and more efficient tools. He might as well have told me that I was too old, too expensive, and in his way. I did not say a word. I simply looked at the thin file in his hands, realizing he had never read my technical reports, my security audits, or my compliance memos. He was not evaluating my work. He was building a narrative to justify my termination. I walked out of the room before he finished speaking. I did not slam the door or say anything. I returned to my desk, opened my private storage drive, and executed the compliance protocol I had set up weeks ago. The script ran in under 12 seconds, moving our primary root decryption keys into legal escrow under a maintenance task title. I then sent a brief email to General Counsel Dorothy Ward with the subject line regarding custody transfer. Her office replied 8 minutes later, confirming that the secure escrow had been engaged and the custody chain recorded. My entire network architecture was now secured under a lock that could only be opened with the explicit approval of the board of directors. If the systems broke, nobody could bypass the lock without my cooperation. Later that afternoon, Preston walked into the main data room where I was running diagnostics on a server rack. The room was cold, filled with the loud, constant hum of cooling fans and the faint smell of ozone. He looked at the glowing blue lights and the humming equipment, shaking his head. "All this just to look pretty?" he said, gesturing toward the rack. "My daughter has a nightlight that does more." He laughed, expecting the department to join in. The room went completely silent. Fiona Briggs stopped typing, and Nate Ross froze in his chair. Devin Miller stared at the floor, unable to look at either of us. I did not say a word. I slowly closed my laptop, the soft click of the lid sounding like a latch snapping shut on a weapon. I stood up, slid my security badge into my coat pocket, and walked toward the exit. "Where are you heading, Gavin?" Preston asked, his voice breezy and casual. "Lunch," I replied, "and after that we will see." He nodded, completely unaware of what he had done. As I walked out, I heard him tell the remaining engineers to begin decommissioning our secondary node cluster to save off on power costs. He did not realize that he had just removed the last safety net. I left the building, carrying my laptop bag and 13 years of memories, leaving behind a silent countdown that nobody else could see or stop. The countdown progressed silently, just as I had designed it. It began with a minor database synchronization failure on our eastern routing node. Normally, our automated recovery scripts would have detected the error, rescheduled the task, and kept the system running without anyone noticing. But the orchestration layer was now blind, unable to verify the system integrity because I had revoked the primary heartbeat token before leaving. 3 minutes later, a critical security certificate expired. The automated renewal system tried to run, but it required a secure ping from the heartbeat service that was no longer active. The certificate remained expired, and internal network traffic began to fail silently. Without a valid certificate, our microservices could not authenticate each other's requests. The order management system could not talk to the ledger, and the ledger could not verify account balances. The logs were filled with authentication handshake errors and timeout warnings. At exactly 9:42, the primary database node rejected a connection from the transaction cluster, and a cascading lockout began to spread across the entire infrastructure. The monitoring dashboard, which was normally a sea of calm green indicators, began flashing amber and then solid red. The primary database cluster reported a database connection limit exceeded error as hundreds of microservices repeatedly tried to establish handshakes using the expired certificate. Each failed attempt consumed memory resources, leading to a memory leakage that eventually crashed the core container orchestration engine. Devin Miller tried to log into the primary routing nodes, but his terminal screen froze with a connection timed out error, indicating that the network routing tables themselves had become corrupted due to the lack of heartbeat validation updates. The orchestration layer, now assuming false negatives across multiple regions, began pulling in outdated recovery routines that relied on expired cache values. The system began to collapse in a perfect logical sequence. Our public-facing dashboard stopped refreshing, and the client mobile application began throwing error 503. The transaction queues backed up, and our customer support lines were flooded with calls from angry clients who could not execute block trades or view their account balances. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop 3 miles away from the office, enjoying an oat milk latte in the morning sunlight. I watched the busy streets outside, feeling a deep, unfamiliar sense of peace. The ambient sound of clinking cups and quiet chatter from the families at the nearby tables contrasted sharply with the rising panic on my phone screen. I watched a city bus pull up to the curb, a young couple arguing over a paper map, and the gentle breeze rustling the green leaves of the trees. I watched a barista steam milk, the steam escaping with a loud hiss that sounded like a releasing valve. A child at a corner table dropped a plastic toy, and his mother laughed as she picked it up. The sheer normality of these everyday human interactions was a stark contrast to the invisible storm raging across the servers. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat. My phone began to buzz repeatedly on the wooden table, the mechanical vibration sounding like a frantic insect against the polished oak surface. I picked it up and saw the screen flashing with missed calls. I received 3 missed calls from the operations center, followed by urgent text messages from Devin and Fiona. Devin texted, "The Eastern routing node is throwing validation errors and the certificate authority is rejecting our renewal requests." "Do you know where the recovery keys are?" Fiona added. "We are seeing stale database sessions across all clusters, and the front end is timing out completely. The entire portfolio engine is grinding to a halt." Finally, an email arrived from the Chief Technology Officer demanding to know if I was available to assist with a critical outage. I ignored them all, sipping my coffee and watching our system latency metrics climb on my personal tablet. I could see the transaction queue delay growing from 10 seconds to 3 minutes, and then to a complete standstill. The company was losing thousands of dollars every minute the systems were down, and their client confidence was evaporating in real time. Back at the office, the engineering floor was in a state of absolute chaos. The customer relations director had rushed onto the floor, shouting about the massive trading losses and demanding immediate answers. The chief technology officer finally convened an emergency meeting, looping in the operations team and the legal department. Preston was silent, sitting at the table and frantically clicking buttons on his laptop, trying to figure out how to restart the servers. He did not know that his decision to decommission the secondary node cluster had destroyed the only alternative pathway. During the panic, a junior analyst named Liam Scott noticed a yellow post-it note stuck to the side of my empty computer monitor. I had written a single sentence on it in neat, clear print. Liam read the note aloud to the room. "The restoration key is held in legal escrow, releasable only upon a written directive from the board of directors." The room went dead silent. The chief technology officer turned slowly to look at Preston, his face pale. At the same moment, the chief executive officer, Charles Albright, burst into the war room. He had rushed to the office in his gym clothes, sweating and looking completely disheveled, holding his phone in a tight grip. "Why is our primary portfolio engine offline?" Charles demanded, slamming his water bottle onto the table. "Where is Gavin? Why isn't he fixing this?" Kristen, representing Human Resources, stepped forward to explain the situation. "Gavin resigned yesterday under Clause 14C of his contract," she said. The resignation was immediate and legally binding due to public undermining of his role. Charles stared at her, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation began to set in. "What do you mean he resigned? And what is this about a legal escrow?" The emergency board session was convened 30 minutes later, with the directors joining via video conference. General Counsel Dorothy Ward explained the legal reality to the assembled executives and board members. "The encryption keys for our core routing services were placed in secure legal escrow this morning," she stated. "Under the terms of Gavin's on-contract, those keys can only be released upon a majority vote of the board of directors. Any attempt to bypass this protocol or force an administrative override would violate our compliance framework and is legally void ab initio. The agreement is binding, and we cannot legally access the systems without his key." She also explained that attempting to force a manual backdoor into the system without the proper keys would violate Section 502 of the California Penal Code, which deals with unauthorized computer access, as well as multiple federal security compliance acts. The board members nodded on their video screens, realizing they were completely trapped. The chairman of the board spoke next, his voice heavy with resignation. He stated that the board had no choice but to immediately approve the motion to request the release of the keys from legal escrow, and that they must also address the severe management failure that had led to this crisis. One board member, representing our largest institutional investor, noted that the system outage had already cost the company $3 million in direct revenue and threatened their regulatory standing with the government. He shouted through the speaker, demanding to know how a single manager could have the authority to put the entire firm at risk. Dorothy Ward responded calmly, pointing out that Gavin had flagged these risks for months, but his warnings were systematically ignored and deleted by Preston Cade. She added that the escrow agreement was a legally binding document signed by the previous chief executive officer to protect the company's intellectual property, and that trying to breach it would result in a class action lawsuit from shareholders for breach of contract. The chief technology officer sat with his head in his hands, while Charles Albright turned his furious gaze toward Preston Cade. "You disabled our secondary backups and canceled our security audits to save a few $1,000s," Charles said, his voice trembling with anger. "And in doing so, you committed a clear breach of fiduciary duty to this company. Under state corporate law, an officer who acts with reckless disregard for core assets is personally liable for the resulting damages. You pushed out the only person who understood how to run our infrastructure, and now our entire business is paralyzed. You are personally responsible for this disaster. Our legal team will review our options, and we may file a civil suit against you to recover the millions of dollars we are losing right now." Preston turned pale, his hands shaking as he tried to gather his printed documents. The board of directors voted unanimously to terminate Preston's employment immediately, without severance, citing gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. Preston was ordered to pack his personal belongings and leave the premises immediately. I was told later that he packed his desk in absolute silence, placing his expensive sandalwood cologne and a notebook into a cardboard box while the remaining engineers watched him without saying a word. A security guard escorted him out of the building, past the empty desk where I had worked for over 13 years. The board then authorized the immediate release of the escrow keys and directed Charles to contact me directly. Charles sent me a text message that read, "We will pay whatever you ask. Please come back and fix this." I received the message while I was sitting in the airport terminal, waiting for my flight to depart. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction, but I did not reply. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was my older brother Stuart Vance, who was the director of infrastructure at a major rival firm. He had been trying to recruit me for months, knowing the value of my experience. Stuart offered me a chief technology officer position with complete operational autonomy, double my previous salaries, significant stock options, and a full relocation package to Seattle. During our phone call, we discussed their current infrastructure challenges, their microservice migration plans, and how they wanted to build a system that could withstand any executive interference. He said, "Gavin, we need someone who actually knows how to design a resilient network from the ground up, and we will give you the budget and the team to do it right. No vice presidents of operations will ever tell you how to light up your server racks." I smiled and accepted their offer on the spot. I looked out the window at the airplanes taxiing across the tarmac in the afternoon sun. I heard the gate agent announce the final boarding call for my flight to Seattle. I had spent 13 years building and protecting a system for a company that only appreciated my work when it ceased to exist. I was no longer their nightlight, and they would have to learn how to navigate the dark without me. I turned off my phone, slid it into my pocket, and boarded my flight, leaving the past behind me. Thanks for watching, you Cubicle Warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes.